Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex ideas, sort of cut through the noise, and help make sense of them. Today, we're diving into a really big one, predestination. It's a concept, that's caused centuries of debate, lots of confusion, really pitting divine will against human free will. So our goal today is to tackle that confusion head on. We'll be exploring a pretty nuanced perspective from Reverend Sun Myung Moon's teachings. The idea is to see how those seemingly contradictory Bible verses might actually fit together, giving us a fuller picture of God's plan and, importantly, our role in it.
Right. And we'll be looking at what's called the principle, specifically the unification principle. Think of it as a theological framework. It offers a unique way to look at these old questions, moving beyond that absolute fate versus human effort argument. We want to reveal more of a dynamic partnership, which really reshapes how we see God, our own responsibility, and, well, even how history unfolds. It's about connecting the dots.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When we talk predestination, the Bible, well, it seems to give us two pretty different stories, doesn't it? Almost opposites. It's like this theological tug of war. Let's start with the side that suggests everything's absolutely fixed by God. Where do we see that?
Yeah, there are definitely some powerful passages that lean that way, especially if you read them on their own. Take Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 30. He says, "Those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified." That sounds like a completely sealed process, right? No room for change.
Very direct.
And then in Romans 9, verses 15-16, he quotes God saying, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy." So it depends not upon man's will or exertion, but upon God's mercy. He even uses that potter and clay analogy in verse 21. Does the potter not have the right over the clay?
Right, to make one vessel for beauty, another for common use.
Exactly. And then there's the Jacob and Esau story. God loving Jacob, hating Esau while they're still in the womb, declaring the elder will serve the younger. People often take that as proof of a destiny fixed before birth. So yeah, strong biblical grounds for absolute predestination.
It really is compelling stuff. Makes you wonder, if it's all set, why bother trying? But then, like you said, there's the other side. You look elsewhere in Scripture, and the whole picture seems to shift. What challenges that absolute view?
That's the tension, isn't it? The Bible also gives us plenty of reasons to question absolute predestination. Think about the human fall itself. God warned Adam and Eve not to eat the fruit. That warning suggests they had a choice, right?
Yeah, otherwise why warn them?
Exactly. And if the fall was all part of God's plan, why does Genesis say God was sorry he made man, that it grieved him to his heart? Grief seems, well, out of place if it was all foreordained.
Good point.
Then look at salvation. John's gospel says, "Whoever believes in Christ shall not perish." Whoever believes that implies choice, not that some are just destined to perish. And Jesus' own words, "Ask, and it will be given you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened." That's all about human initiative, human effort. Even praying for the sick, the instructions imply our prayers, our faith, can actually make a difference, that health isn't just, predetermined.
So it leaves us with this huge theological puzzle, a real paradox.
Yeah.
You've got solid arguments for both sides, straight from the Bible. No wonder there's been so much confusion over the centuries. So how does the principle you mentioned help us untangle this?
Right. This is where the principle offers a path forward. It starts by clarifying our understanding of God's will. See, God's original purpose for creation didn't happen as planned because of the fall. So God's will now is what we call the providence of restoration. It's his ongoing work to restore everything back to that original ideal state. That's his fundamental desire.
Okay, so God's will is about restoration, getting back to the original goodness. But does that mean he predestines everything that happens, good and bad, as part of that process? Does evil serve his purpose somehow?
No, not at all. And that's a really crucial point. The principle is very clear. God is the author of goodness. Therefore, he cannot predestine anything that obstructs his purpose. He couldn't have predestined the fall or sin or, the destruction of the cosmos. If evil was just part of his plan, he wouldn't be purely good. And we see his regret, his sorrow over fallen humanity or over King Saul's failures. That shows evil isn't from his predestination. It's from human failure, from us basically siding with destructive forces instead of with God.
That really changes the dynamic. So God's will is for good. He doesn't predestine evil. But how absolute is his will for the ultimate goal, the restoration of creation? Is that part fixed?
Yes, absolutely. Because God himself is absolute, unique, Eternal, unchanging, his will to fulfill the purpose of creation is also absolute, unique, and unchanging. His ultimate goal will be achieved. Like the scripture says, I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it. But here's the key insight from the principle. Since God's will is absolute, if the person he chooses to carry out a part of that will fails, well, God doesn't give up on the will. He has to continue the providence by choosing someone else to take up that mission. The goal remains fixed, but the path, the personnel can change.
Ah, okay.
We see this pattern repeatedly. Adam fails, so eventually Jesus comes as the second Adam. Cain and Abel fail. God tries again with Noah, then Abraham. Abel fails. Seth takes his place symbolically. Moses doesn't complete his mission. Joshua takes over. Judas fails. Matthias is chosen. God's ultimate goal is non-negotiable, but he works through history, adapting his approach based on human response.
So the ultimate goal is absolute, but the path to get there is adaptable, contingent on human partnership. That's a really critical distinction. It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from just a fixed destiny towards how God's will actually gets done and who gets involved.
Precisely. And that brings us to the principle of creation, which basically says God's purpose can only be fully realized when human beings complete their portion of responsibility. God's will for restoration is absolute, yes, but its actual fulfillment requires human action. It's a collaboration.
A collaboration. So it's not just God acting alone. Our part, our responsibility is essential. What exactly is this portion of responsibility? How much is on us?
This is where the principle offers that very specific idea. God's 95% responsibility and the 5% responsibility of the central figure.
95.5. 5% sounds tiny.
It does, compared to God's immense effort, his grace, his planning. But the principle stresses that for us humans, that 5% is like 100% of our effort. It requires our total commitment, our full devotion within that specific area God asks of us.
So it's small relative to God, but total effort from our side.
Exactly. Think of it maybe like God designs the whole project, provides all the materials, that's the 95%, but we're the ones who actually have to, lay the bricks according to the plan, that's the 5%. If we don't do our part, the project stalls.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we see this conditional nature everywhere in the Bible. Adam and Eve's destiny depended on them not eating the fruit, their 5%. Noah's mission depended on his dedication in building the ark. Even Jesus' mission for complete salvation was conditional on the people's belief and support their 5%. And sadly, the record shows that time and again, people struggled even with that small portion, which is why the providence got prolonged, why the ideal world kept being postponed.
Wow, that really puts weight on human choice, even the seemingly small choices. And it clicks with those verses we talked about earlier. The prayer of faith will save the sick. Your faith has made you well. Ask and you receive.
Yes. Those aren't just nice sayings. They confirm this principle. God's will gets fulfilled contingent on us doing our part. It highlights both things, how small our part is compared to God's work, but also how incredibly difficult it seems to have been for key people in history to actually fulfill even that small part. It's the gap between potential and reality.
Okay, we've talked big picture, the 955 principle, the flow of history. But let's bring it down to us, to individuals. What does this mean for my destiny? Am I predestined to be a certain way?
That's the question everyone asks, isn't it? And the principle is quite clear here. God does not absolutely predestine what kind of person you actually become. Your potential, the ideal person God envisions for you, that's there. But whether you realize that potential, whether you become that person, is contingent on you completing your portion of responsibility. Your choices, your efforts, they shape your reality.
So we're not just reading lines from a pre-written script. Our actions really forge who we become. That lines up with those biblical examples where things didn't go as initially planned, right? Most Tuesday.
Exactly. Take Moses. He was conditionally predestined to lead the people into Canaan. That was the mission. But he failed his responsibility at Kadesh Barnea, striking the rock twice in anger. Because of that failure, he wasn't allowed to enter the Promised Land. His specific predestined mission wasn't fully realized due to his choice.
And Judas Iscariot?
Same principle.
Yeah.
Chosen as a disciple, predestined for a vital role. But he turned faithless, chose betrayal. He didn't fulfill his potential destiny. And even on a larger scale, the Jewish people, they were conditionally predestined to be this glorified nation that would receive the Messiah. But when their leaders rejected Jesus, sent him to the cross, that specific destiny for that time wasn't realized. It shows the power and sometimes the tragedy of collective human choice. God's providence, you see, it starts small, like one point, and then gradually expands. So he chooses these central figures for specific roles, and he chooses carefully often someone born into the right lineage, with the right character traits, the right background, living at the right time and place for what needs to be done. It's based on potential.
So God foreknows who has the potential, the qualifications, to be a good fit for a mission. But their success, whether they actually fulfill it, still comes down to their choices, their 5%.
Precisely. It's always a partnership. God initiates, he empowers, he guides, but the human element, that response, is indispensable.
Okay, this is really clarifying. So with this framework, conditional predestination, the 955 responsibility, let's go back to those verses that sounded so absolute at the beginning. How do we reread them now? Does the puzzle start to fit together?
Yes, I think it does. When you apply this principle, the apparent contradictions dissolve. Let's look at Romans 8:29-30 again. Whom he foreknew, he also predestined, called, justified, glorified. Okay, God, being omniscient, foreknows who has the qualifications, the potential to be a central figure. He then predestines them for that role and calls them. That's God's initiative, his 95%. But justification and glorification, those steps are contingent on the person actually fulfilling their 5% responsibility after being called. The verse states the chain, but the traditional interpretation often misses the conditional link based on human response.
So the human part is assumed or implied, but crucial.
Exactly. Now, Romans 9.15:16, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, depends not upon man's will, but upon God's mercy. This isn't saying your ultimate fate is sealed regardless of your actions. It's emphasizing God's sovereign right to choose who he wants to initiate his providence through. His choice of whom to call for a mission isn't based on human effort trying to earn that calling. It highlights God's grace and authority in selecting the players, not necessarily dictating the final score before the game starts.
Okay, so it's about God's right to choose his partners, not about fixing the outcome for everyone from the start. That's a good way to put it. And the potter and clay analogy in Romans 9.21. Has the potter no right over the clay. The principle explains refers to humanity after the fall. God originally gave humans a high position, responsibility to be lords of creation. But they failed. They violated this condition, becoming refused spiritually. So in that fallen state, humans lost the right to complain about how God deals with them or what roles he assigns them in the restoration process. It's about the consequences of forfeiting their original standing, not about God creating some people just for destruction.
That makes a lot more sense than the harsh interpretation. What about Jacob and Esau? God loving one and hating the other in the womb. That still sounds pretty absolute.
It does on the surface, but the principle offers a providential view. This favoritism wasn't about their eternal destinies being sealed. It was about setting up a specific dynamic for the providence of restoration. Jacob was positioned symbolically as Abel, the favored second son, and Esau as Cain, the elder who lost favor, specifically to create a condition to recover the birthright that Cain had lost. So hated wasn't personal hatred, but about Esau being in Cain's symbolic position.
Exactly. Esau stood in the position representing the lineage that had failed God previously. Jacob stood in Abel's position, representing the line God could now work through to move forward. It was about their roles in the historical drama.
Okay.
And here's the crucial part. Their final outcome wasn't fixed by this positioning. Later in life, Esau rose above his initial hated position by humbling himself before Jacob. He fulfilled his responsibility in that situation and received God's blessing for it.
So his actions changed things.
Yes. And conversely, if Jacob had failed his responsibility, he would have lost God's favor despite the initial positioning. So the initial love and hate were about setting the stage for a specific providential purpose, not about their unchangeable personal fates.
Wow. Okay, that explanation, especially about Esau rising above his position, really untangles that passage for me. It seems like the core issue all along was, as the principle suggests, being ignorant of the true relationship between God's portion of responsibility and the human portion.
Precisely. Understanding the interplay resolves the dilemma.
It moves us past that rigid, absolute versus free-for-all debate into something much more, dynamic and meaningful. So let's just recap the core idea from this deep dive. God's ultimate will for goodness, for restoration, for fulfilling his purpose that's absolute, unchanging. But how that will gets fulfilled in our world, that's always a collaboration. It involves God's huge part, the 95%, but it absolutely requires our essential human part, that 5%. It's a partnership.
Exactly. And that understanding is incredibly empowering, isn't it? It gives real meaning to our choices, our efforts, even our prayers. Predestination isn't some cold, fixed script we're forced to follow. It's a dynamic covenant, a living partnership with God. It means that what we do, even our seemingly tiny 5%, genuinely matters. It has significance in helping realize God's much larger absolute will for goodness and restoration. It puts immense value back onto human freedom and responsibility, right at the heart of God's plan.
It really makes you feel like your life, your decisions actually count for something big.
They do. And maybe that leaves us with a thought to ponder. If even that small portion of human responsibility can shift the course of God's providence, affect who gets chosen, how history unfolds, what's the potential collective impact of our choices today? What seemingly small 5% contribution could you make right where you are in your life, your community, to align with that greater purpose, to help build that restored world? It's definitely something powerful to think about.